The guards had my arms, and Ranach had his hand already lifted for the signal, when the west wing doors opened behind us, and the whole hall forgot how to breathe. Cedric stood in the doorway, alive, upright, his face bared for the first time in a year to anyone who was not already sworn to keep his secret, and I watched 200 wolves who had spent that year believing their king too broken to be seen drop to their knees at the sight of him. "Release her," he said, and his voice did not shake at all, though I could see, even from across that hall, exactly what standing there in the open was costing him. I did not know yet whether we had proof enough to survive what came next. I only knew that whatever happened, I was done being the secret someone else got to decide the fate of. Let me tell you how I ended up in that hall, because it started, absurdly, with a door that looked like every other door in the palace. It was 3 days earlier, an ordinary Tuesday, and I was hauling a basket of laundry through a servants' corridor I had walked 100 times without incident, when I found the usual passage blocked by a fallen support beam the castle stewards had not yet cleared. I took the side corridor instead, the one I had been told, vaguely, led nowhere useful, and found, at the end of it, a plain wooden door that looked exactly like every linen closet I had ever hauled a basket into. I pushed it open without knocking, the way you push open a door you assume is empty, and found a man standing at a window with his back to me, tall and still in a way that made the whole room feel colder than the corridor had been. He turned. I saw his face. I did not understand, in that first frozen moment, why the sight of an ordinary man's face should have made my whole chest go tight with the sense that I had just done something irreversible. I only knew that he looked at me the way a man looks at a door he has spent a year hoping would never open, and that whatever expression crossed his own face in that instant was not fear of me. It was something closer to recognition, raw and unguarded, the look of a man who has been alone with a secret for so long that another person's simple presence undoes him. "Who are you?" he said, low, urgent, already crossing the room toward me. "Orla," I said, because it seemed the only honest thing to offer a stranger who had just looked at me like I was either a threat or a miracle and had not yet decided which. I took a wrong turn. "I am sorry, I did not mean to. You cannot leave," he said. I laughed, because it seemed the reasonable response to a strange man in an empty wing telling a laundry maid she could not leave a linen closet. "I assure you, I have laundry to deliver, and a mistress who will notice if I do not. I am not making a request." Something in his voice had gone hard, controlled, a man forcing calm over something considerably less calm underneath. "You do not understand what you have just seen. I need you to understand that before either of us decides anything else." That was the moment 2 guards burst through the door behind me, weapons half drawn, and froze the instant they saw who I was looking at. "Your Grace," one of them said, and dropped to one knee so fast I heard his armour rattle, and I understood, watching him kneel to a man I had assumed was simply another servant caught somewhere he should not be, that I had wandered into something considerably larger than a linen closet. I did not know yet that the man standing in that room was King Cedric of Duskmere, who the entire kingdom believed too gravely wounded from an assassination attempt a year earlier to be seen by anyone outside his most trusted household. I only knew, looking between his face and the guards' bowed heads, that whatever I had just stumbled into, there was no simple way to walk back out of it. I was taken, not to a dungeon as I half expected, but to a modest chamber in the same sealed wing, and left there for the better part of a day while, I gathered later, an entire household argued in low, urgent voices about what to do with me. It was Rolf, the king's second, who finally came to explain it, sitting across from me with the particular, careful weight of a man deciding how much truth a stranger could be trusted with. "A year ago," he said, "the king was attacked in his own council chamber, poisoned and struck near fatally before his own guard could reach him. He survived, barely, and has spent the year since recovering in secret, in this wing, while Regent Rannoch rules in his name, presenting the king's continued seclusion as a matter of slow healing, rather than admitting how close the crown came to losing him entirely. "Why the secrecy?" I asked. "Surely a king recovering from an attack on his life deserves sympathy, not hiding." "Because whoever ordered that attack is still unaccounted for," Rolf said, "and the king does not yet know how far their reach extends into his own court. If they believed him dead or dying quietly, they grew careless. If they learn he is recovering and asking questions, they may finish what they started before he has proof enough to name them." I sat with that a long moment, and I have just seen his face. "You have," Rolf said. "Which means, whether either of you likes it, you are now inside a secret that several people would very much prefer stayed buried. The king is not being cruel keeping you here. He is being careful with the one thing he has left to be careful with." I did not entirely believe that yet, not fully. Not from a man I had known for less than a day. I would come to understand it soon enough. "What happens to me?" I asked, because it seemed the more pressing question than any comfort Rolf was offering. "If I am now inside this secret, as you say, do I simply stay in this room until the danger passes, however long that takes?" "That has not yet been decided," Rolf admitted. "I will tell you plainly, because I think you deserve plainness more than reassurance. No one in this household has ever had to decide what to do with someone who discovered the king alive by accident. We have only ever had to decide how to protect the ones who already knew. That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not. I suspect the king intends to give you one himself." I spent the rest of that afternoon alone in the small chamber, turning the strangeness of my own situation over in my mind the way I might have turned over a coin of foreign make, uncertain what it was actually worth or what I was meant to do with it. I was not afraid, exactly. I found that curious in itself. I was, more than anything, furious at the unfairness of having my entire life rearranged by a door that had given me no warning at all. Cedric came to see me himself that evening, and I understood, watching him cross that small chamber, exactly how much the year of hiding had cost him. He moved like a man still guarding an old wound, careful in ways that had nothing to do with formal bearing, and everything to do with pain he had simply learned to carry quietly. "I am sorry," he said, without preamble, "for how that went. I have had a year to prepare for the possibility of being seen again, and none of my preparation involved a laundry maid taking a wrong turn. I did notice the door looked exactly like every other door in this palace," I said. "You might consider a sign." Something flickered across his face that I would learn, over the following days, was the closest thing he had to a genuine laugh. Brief, startled out of him, gone almost as soon as it arrived. "I will take that under advisement." "Why me?" I asked. Because it was the question I had been circling since the moment he first looked at me. "You said I could not leave. You did not say why, beyond the danger of the secret itself. There was something else in your face when you first saw me. I am not foolish enough to pretend I did not notice it." He was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its careful formality entirely. "I do not fully understand it myself. I have not felt anything but grief and suspicion in a year. I looked at you and felt, for one moment, something that was neither of those things, and I do not know what to call it beyond the fact that it frightened me considerably more than the assassin's blade did. I did not have an answer ready for that, so I asked him something easier instead. What was it like? Before, being a king people were actually allowed to look at. Something in his face softened, remembering rather than guarding for once. Loud, exhausting, I complained about it constantly, and did not appreciate, until it was taken from me, how much I had liked simply walking through my own halls and being seen doing it. A year in one sealed wing teaches you exactly how much of being alive depends on other people knowing you exist. Then let me be the first inconvenient proof that you still do, I said, and watched something in him ease, just slightly, at hearing it said so plainly. We talked longer than either of us intended that first evening, about small things mostly, the sound the castle made at night from inside a wing no one else used, the particular loneliness of eating every meal alone for a year, the way he had started talking to Rolf about nothing at all, simply to remember what an ordinary conversation felt like. I found myself, without quite deciding to, telling him about my own family, my mother's insistence that a laundry maid's hands told you more about her character than any noble's manners ever could, and he listened the way I would come to learn he listened to everything. Completely. As though it were the only true information reaching him all year. Which, I suspected, it very nearly was. I did not have an answer ready for what was growing between us in that small sealed room, so I let it grow anyway, while the rest of the castle went on, unaware, believing its king too broken to be seen by anyone at all. I remained in that sealed wing far longer than either of us said aloud that it meant anything, because Rolf refused, flatly, to let me return to ordinary castle life, while Rannoch's people were still watching every corridor for signs the king's seclusion might be ending. I told myself I was simply waiting out the danger. I did not entirely believe myself even at the time. I learned, in those days, the actual shape of what had happened to him, not from Rolf's careful summaries, but from Cedric himself, in small pieces, over quiet evenings, in a room that had become, without either of us deciding it plainly, a place where we told each other true things. Rannoch served my father for 30 years, he told me, one evening, staring at a fire that had burned low. I trusted him the way you trust furniture that has simply always been in the room. I did not think to question who benefited most from a council chamber attack that nearly killed me, and left him as the only steady hand left to hold the crown while I recovered. I have spent a year piecing together proof I could not gather from a sickbed, quietly, through the few people I still trust completely. And you have not found enough yet, not enough to survive an accusation that fails, he said. If I stand before my court and name him without airtight proof, and he survives the accusation, I will have handed him the very thing he has wanted all along. Grounds to declare me unfit to rule, and himself the steadier hand for the crown. How close are you? I asked. Close enough to know it exists somewhere in his own household's records, he said, and not close enough to have my hands on it. I have had Rolf combing what he can reach for months. Every avenue we have tried has run into a wall Rannoch built carefully enough that I begin to suspect he anticipated exactly this kind of quiet investigation. Then perhaps he did not anticipate a laundry maid with nothing better to do and considerably less to lose than a king's own household. Something in his face shifted, weighing the offer before he had fully let himself hope in it. I would not ask that of you. You are not asking, I said. I am offering. There is a considerable difference, and I would ask you to let me make my own choice about it, the same way I am asking you to let me stay in a room I did not choose to be locked inside of. If you want to find out whether Rannoch ever discovered exactly how much I had seen, and what Cedric's wolf did the day he finally stood in front of his own court again, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when a king who has been hiding for a year finally has a reason to stop. Then we find the proof, I said, and felt, saying it, the same reckless certainty that had once made me push open an unfamiliar door without knocking. I began going through what records Rolf could smuggle into that sealed wing without drawing attention. Supply requisitions, physicians' ledgers, the guest lists of the council chamber the night of the attack, and it was in the physician's own record, 3 days into my search, that I found the detail that finally mattered. The poison used against Cedric was rare, slow, and precisely calibrated, the kind requiring a physician's expertise to prepare correctly. And only one physician in Duskmere had the specific training to mix it in that exact dose. That physician had, for the past 11 years, been retained privately and exclusively by Regent Rannoch's own household. I sat with that ledger a long time, understanding, with the particular cold clarity of a fact rearranging everything around it, that the man ruling Duskmere in Cedric's name had very likely arranged the attack meant to end his reign before it truly began. I brought the finding to Cedric that same night, my hands not quite steady on the ledger's worn pages. He read it twice, in silence, and when he finally looked up, something in his face had gone colder and more certain than I had yet seen it. 30 years, he said, quiet. I called that man uncle, in private when I was young enough not to know better. I do not think I have ever hated anyone the way I hate him in this exact moment, and I find I am almost grateful for the clarity of it, after a year of only grief and suspicion tangled together with nowhere to land. Then, let the clarity be useful, I said. Not just felt. He nodded, slow, and I watched a king who had spent a year hiding begin, for the first time to plan instead. Rannoch, it turned out, had noticed something was different long before we had proof ready to use. He moved first through the simplest possible channel, a quiet reassignment order, delivered to my former mistress within the week, transferring the laundry maid, who had briefly gone missing in the castle's west corridors, to a distant household 2 days' ride away, citing a shortage of staff that did not actually exist. It was, I understood the moment Rolf told me of it, an attempt to remove me from the castle entirely before I became inconvenient in some larger way Rannoch had not yet named aloud. Cedric refused the transfer the moment he learned of it, quietly but absolutely, through channels that did not require him to reveal himself at all. I do not know whether Rannoch understood, in that refusal, exactly how much danger his own position was now in. I suspect he understood perfectly, and simply decided the time for careful patience had run out. His second move came 6 days later, and it very nearly finished what the first attack had started. Rolf discovered, only hours before it might have succeeded, that the modest evening meal prepared for Cedric's sealed wing had been intercepted somewhere between the kitchens and the door, the usual taster's portion swapped, with practiced, professional care. It was Rolf's own habit of arriving early, restless with the same unease that had kept him doubling watches since my discovery, that caught the swap before Cedric ever lifted the spoon. I was in the room when Rolf came through the door pale and breathless with the ruined tray still in his hands, and I understood, watching Cedric's face go carefully blank in the particular way of a man refusing to let fear show, exactly how close we had just come to losing everything before we had a chance to use it. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat instead in the chair nearest his, neither of us speaking much, simply present. The way I had learned over those weeks was the only thing that ever actually helped. That is the closest either of us came to losing everything before we ever reached the throne room, and it told us, plainly, that whatever proof we had gathered needed to be used before Rannoch found a method that did not fail. We moved within 2 days, timed to land during the anniversary ceremony Rannoch himself had arranged, a formal court gathering, ostensibly to mark 1 year of his steady regency. In truth, I suspected, the moment he intended to quietly propose making his stewardship permanent. It was, Cedric decided, exactly the stage on which the truth would land hardest. I stood at the edge of that hall in a servant's plain dress, the only clothing I owned, while Rannoch delivered a long, practiced speech about sacrifice and steady leadership in a king's continued absence. And I watched 200 wolves nod along with every carefully rehearsed word. It was Rolf who moved first, presenting the physician's ledger before the assembled court and asking, plainly. Why the one man in Duskmere qualified to prepare the poison used against the king had spent 11 years in Regent Rannoch's private employ. The hall's polite attention turned, in an instant, to something considerably sharper. Rannoch's composure held for exactly as long as it took him to begin explaining the ledger away as coincidence, and it was in the middle of that explanation that the west wing doors opened, and Cedric walked through them. That is the moment I told you about at the very beginning of this. The guard's hands still on my arms from an earlier, smaller scuffle Rannoch's own men had started, the moment they saw the ledger produced. Rannoch's hand lifted for a signal that never finished being given, and an entire hall dropping to its knees at the sight of a king they had been told for a year was too broken to stand in front of them. "Release her," Cedric said, and the guards did, instantly, and I watched Rannoch's face do the slow, catastrophic work of understanding that every careful piece of his year-long deception had just collapsed in a single moment he could not undo. "I have had a year to gather what I needed," Cedric said, his voice carrying to the back wall, despite the visible cost of standing, exposed in front of so many people for the first time since the attack. "A poison prepared by your own physician. A regency you were, I am told, quietly preparing to make permanent this very evening. I would ask the court to consider whether a man that patient in his ambition was ever truly serving the crown he claims he protected." Rannoch's wolf, straining beneath a composure that had clearly been cracking since the ledger's first mention, surged forward toward the throne with a final desperate aggression, and it was Cedric's own wolf, restrained for a year by a wound still not fully healed. That met him halfway across that hall, pinning him to the floor with a force that made the decision for the entire court before anyone needed to formally vote on it. The captives of Rannoch's long deception, once the truth finally stood in front of them undeniable, did something I had not expected. One by one, the very court that had knelt automatically to the throne, knelt again. This time deliberately, turning partway toward me as well, the laundry maid who had pushed open the wrong door and refused to disappear quietly when someone more powerful decided that would be convenient. Rannoch was stripped of his regency and his standing within the hour, his private accounts and his physician's practice seized for full inquiry, and he was escorted from Duskmere's halls in considerably less finery than he had worn delivering his anniversary speech that same morning. Cedric found me afterward in a quiet corridor outside that hall, still visibly unsteady from the effort of standing exposed for the first time in a year, holding the small brass key to the sealed west wing door that I had, without quite deciding to, kept in my apron pocket since the day everything changed. "I have spent 3 days trying to prove to you that you had not simply been trapped by a frightened, hiding man," he said. "And I do not think nearly losing my own throne in the process was the demonstration I had planned." "It worked anyway," I said, "though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it." He looked at the key still in my hand, then at me, something in his face finally losing the last of its careful, guarded formality. "I do not know how to properly court a woman I first met by telling her she could never leave. I have had a year to grow poor at courtship and considerably better at hiding." "You already managed it," I said. "You told me the truth, every evening, in a room with the door shut, when you had every reason not to trust anyone at all. That is the only thing you ever needed to do." When he kissed me, careful and uncertain, like a man who had spent a year believing himself finished with the possibility of being wanted for anything beyond his crown, I felt something in my own chest. Some quiet wariness I had carried since the moment 2 guards first dropped to their knees in front of me, finally settle. He claimed me before the full restored court a month later, once he was steady enough on his feet to stand through the whole ceremony unaided, his hand sure on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had spent a year believing their king too broken to rule, and had just watched him prove otherwise. Rolf stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time in a year, entirely unworried. Not every noble accepted it easily. One elderly duke asked, pointedly, whether a laundry maid understood the weight of a crown she had stumbled into, rather than been raised for. I answered him the way I had answered every doubt since the door first opened, plainly without apology, telling him that I had spent a year learning the weight of a king's secrets before I ever touched his crown, and that I suspected few in that hall could claim the same. 6 months later, I stood in that same sealed wing, its door propped permanently open now, with a letter from my own family in one hand and the small brass key, worn smooth from my own nervous handling of it these past months, in the other. My family's letter asked, carefully, whether it was true their daughter, once sent off with nothing but a laundry basket, was Queen of Duskmere now. I wrote back that it was true, and that the door in question had since been given an actual sign, at my own insistence, so that no future laundry maid would stumble into quite so much destiny by accident. Rolf had stopped bracing every time Rannick's name came up in court proceedings, mostly, now that the man sat in confinement rather than a regent's chair. Duskmere's court, once so easily steadied by a patient liar's careful reassurances, had grown considerably more careful about mistaking calm for honesty. And Cedric, once a king so wary of being seen that he had sealed himself behind a plain, unmarked door for a full year, had become, slowly, a king who no longer flinched at being looked at. He still carried the old wound some mornings, a stiffness in his side that the healers said would never fully leave him, and I had learned to recognize the particular quiet way he favored it without asking for help. I did not press him about it. I had learned in that sealed wing that some things heal on their own schedule, and that the kindest thing a person can do is simply stay present for however long that schedule takes. I turned the small brass key over in my fingers and thought about the woman who had pushed open an ordinary-looking door 3 days into an ordinary week. Certain of nothing, beyond a basket of laundry that needed delivering, she had no idea, that ordinary Tuesday, that the wrong room was about to become the only room she would ever truly want to walk into again. She only knew she could not simply back out of what she had already seen. I like to think she would be glad, now, that she never learned to knock. Do you think Cedric would have found his way out of hiding on his own eventually, or did he need someone to walk in on him before he remembered he was allowed to be seen at all? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if you want to stay behind that door a little longer, comment the key, and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for standing in that sealed room with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Duskmere. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills, hiding behind doors that look like every other door, waiting for someone who will not simply turn around. And I intend to tell you every one of their stories.